I'd like to start with a true anecdote, which is that my friends have genuinely asked me to stop sharing facts about wheat to our group chat. I know, what's wrong with them? They must be mad. But to be fair to them, they have been hearing a lot lately about wheat-related innovation, how it was funded by philanthropists, and how it might have saved 1 billion lives. So I'd love to share this story with you now, as I'm here to talk about the huge, and I think still largely hidden potential of philanthropy to completely transform our world. After World War II, the global population shot up, and it really wasn't clear how we were going to grow enough food to feed everybody. In lots of places, the soil was completely depleted of nutrients. Lots of the crops that did grow were destroyed by disease, and the situation got really bad. By the 1960s, scientists were saying mass famine is inevitable. Millions of people might die. However, what they failed to fully take into account was the fact that decades before this, philanthropists had already started funding research into how we could improve crop yields in really difficult conditions. The team was led by this man, Norman Borlaug, and he worked in collaboration with the Mexican government. They made some really incredible innovations. So first, they made the wheat grains about 3 times bigger, which was amazing because they were massive. It wasn't perfect, however, because they kind of fell over. They then made the stems of the wheat much shorter and stronger, which was ideal because they were massive and didn't fall over. Great situation to be in. So after much of what I now call wheat-related YMCA, the team were able to develop really robust, disease-resistant, and incredibly high-yield crops. This new way of doing things spread throughout the entire world, and the results were quite literally miraculous. Entire countries came back from the brink of famine. Global cereal production as a whole tripled in just 50 years, and our friend Norman was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. I really love this story. Not because it was the foolproof solution to global hunger, because of course it wasn't, and actually it was fraught with problems of its own, but because it demonstrates 2 really important ideas that I think we're neglecting to apply to improving the world today. One, it's pretty simple. Huge problems can be solved with the right amount of investment and cooperation. The second is that philanthropy at its best is one of the most transformative tools we have to bring about that improvement. Now, I say at its best because I imagine you all know about philanthropy at its worst. At its worst, it can be little more than a tool in the hands of the ultra-wealthy to manage their own status or their own power. It can have very little regard for what's actually needed or what actually works. Philanthropy at its best, however, is still one of the most powerful tools we have, especially when it can step in and do the things that governments can't do and markets won't do. And this is exactly what happened with Norman and the Green Revolution. Philanthropic funding, to the tune of $100,000 a year from the Rockefeller Foundation in the 40s, in combination with government support, was what we needed to get the project going. If we'd had to wait for governments to take on all of that research and all of the funding, bearing in mind that governments tend to move slowly, and bearing in mind that extremely poor governments don't tend to have an extremely large amount of money, we might have been waiting for a really long time. Similarly, if we'd had to wait for private sector investors to take on all that risk themselves, bearing in mind they probably thought they had more profitable things to be doing, we also might have been waiting a really long time. Philanthropy was the thing that could come in, speed things up, and maybe save millions of lives. And the final incredible fact about this story is I had a really, really hard time choosing to tell it to you today because history is full of these hidden philanthropic success stories. For example, I could have equally told you about the pioneering suffragette and philanthropist Catherine McCormick, who single-handedly funded the development of the contraceptive pill. I could have told you about how 80 million Americans came together to fund the eradication of polio, or about how just 2 foundations funded conferences at the end of the Cold War that dramatically reduced the nuclear stockpile. So, bearing in mind what we can take from all of this, our simple ideas, huge problems can be solved, philanthropy can be transformative. I'd like to invite all of you here today to go through a thought experiment with me. As I say, it's my favorite type of experiment because it's just really cheap to fund. Okay, thought experiment is this. We're all philanthropists. We want to bring about transformative change, maybe even on the scale of the Green Revolution. To do this, we want to start by tackling some of our largest, our most solvable, and our most neglected problems of all time. And I want you to, if you can, imagine something really crazy. We actually have a massive pile of cash to do this with. I know. Now, you might be thinking the eternal question, where are we going to get a massive pile of cash? And I agree, you rarely find them lying around anymore, sadly. But I do have a proposal. The 1%. If everyone in the global top 1% of earners gave away just 10% of their income, or if they are particularly wealthy and this would be more money, gave away just 2.5% of their net worth, we would have an additional $3.5 trillion to improve the world. Now it's a good number. It's a decent amount of money, I agree. Okay, this is $3.5 trillion over and above the $1 trillion that already goes to charity. And this is a surprising bit. If you're earning over $60,000 a year after tax, assuming you're a single person, bringing that home after tax, you are in the global 1%. This is not to say that everyone bringing home 60K can afford to give away 10%, because that is not the case. However, it is to say that global inequality is really, really extreme. Okay, and as a final note, yes, this is just a made-up thought experiment, but I think it can shine a real light on what we can do in monetary terms, what it would take to solve some of our real problems in the real world. So everything I'm about to share is the result of extremely real research by experts at places like the World Bank, the United Nations, and my co-founder Simran Dhaliwal is here tonight, our own much smaller nonprofit, Longview Philanthropy. So, what could we do with 1 year of the 1% giving 10%? Let's find out. For $260 billion, we could ensure that nobody lives below the extreme poverty line for the year. That line is incredibly low. It's $2.15 a day, and 1 in 12 people currently live below that line. One solution to this is really simple and really effective. In fact, it's so simple, people are sometimes confused by it. Why don't we give money directly to the poorest people in the world? And there's a very conveniently named organization that does this called Give Directly. Over 300 studies have been done on this type of cash transfer. And the studies show that this works. And it works because fundamentally, people know what they need, particularly when they're extremely poor. Like Bahati, for example. With her transfer, she bought a tank to store rainwater, livestock, and her first mattress. And the fact that people know what they need is also the reason that cash transfers often do more to boost education than building schools. They often do more to support businesses than business training. And they often do more to improve nutrition than all kinds of food programs. People don't need to be taught to fish. We need to end that meme now. People are capable of fishing and investing and a whole lot else once they're not trapped in completely debilitating poverty. Thank you. For $300 billion, we could massively reduce the risk of the next pandemic. And honestly, what concerns me is that the next one is going to be even worse. And the reason is this. It's currently possible for somebody with the right type of experience in bioengineering to go on the internet, to order the DNA necessary to reconstruct the smallpox virus. And as you'll know, smallpox is a horrendous disease that we've eradicated. To reconstruct that virus and to release it into the world. This is not some wild conjecture or some theory. This is what scientists are warning us about and what studies on similar viruses are showing could be possible now. We are not prepared for this. We're not even prepared for the next natural pandemic. Here are some things we could do. First, we could set up a screening program to track sewage and wastewater for the early signs of the next potential pandemic. Then, we could upgrade existing lab facilities worldwide to ensure that anyone who needs a new vaccine can get it within 6 months. Then, we stockpile enough super effective super PPE to cover every single essential worker in the world, not just people in rich countries. And we can also invest into research into germicidal light and other technologies that could literally kill viruses in the air before we breathe them in. It's really early days, but a breakthrough here could mean the end of airborne disease. For $840 billion, we can double what we spend on clean energy research and development. and really speed up progress to end climate change. Clean energy R&D has been so effective so far. Over the last 10 years, the price of wind energy is down by 50%, and the price of solar energy is down by an incredible 90%. One thing we can do now is build on this and start a clean energy sprint. So yes, wind, and yes, solar, but also nuclear, also geothermal, also better ways of storing the energy we do create, and better ways of removing existing carbon from the air, particularly right at the point where it's emitted. For now very minuscule-looking mere $2 billion, an investment here, an endowment here, could permanently quadruple philanthropic spending to reduce nuclear risk. That is less per year than what we spend on novelty socks. Nuclear risk is almost the highest it's ever been. Right now, thousands of warheads, each capable of killing hundreds of thousands of people, are set on high alert. We know that the early warning systems that should alert us to incoming attacks have a massive history of false alarms, which creates a huge risk of an accidental nuclear strike. And we know, in the event a potential strike is incoming, the US president would have just 15 minutes to decide how to respond. And we know that the US has actually really good early warning systems, comparatively speaking. This situation is absolutely insane. Even if you think that living in a world without nukes is not feasible or not even desirable, there are safer ways to live in a world with nukes than this. And because this is such a neglected area, even a tiny amount of philanthropic funding would go a really long way to getting the better policies we need. Thank you. For $1 billion, we could increase tenfold the philanthropic money going towards AI safety. Bit of light relief, because you're about to need it. That's less per year than what we spend on toys for pets. This little one here is actually my dog, and I think I'm quite a decent chunk of that 1 billion, if I'm honest. So as you know, top AI labs around the world are currently deliberately trying to create AI systems that are smarter than humans at everything humans do, and then some, because it won't stop there. They're funded by tech money from the likes of Google and Microsoft, and most AI researchers think that in the coming years or decades, they're going to succeed. What's going to happen then? We don't know, which is terrifying, because even with the relatively simple systems we have today, like ChatGPT, companies didn't know how they were going to behave in the real world until they released them publicly onto the internet. And yes, they've done some brilliantly helpful things, but they've also done some much less brilliantly helpful things, like threaten to kill people, threaten to hack into people's emails and blackmail them. Now, fortunately, ChatGPT is not an existential risk. But as these systems rapidly become more and more powerful, this way of doing things is going to rapidly become more and more deeply unsafe. We need to put pressure on these companies to slow down, and when the time is right, to maybe even stop. Okay, so we have quite a lot of our budget left. Let's speed things up and see what we can do, not just to survive this century, but to thrive in it. We could fund a 13-year plan to ensure that everybody has access to clean water and sanitation once and for all. We could provide the additional funding needed to make sure that hunger and malnutrition are gone within a decade. We could give women control over their reproductive health and fund free contraceptive. Thank you. Free contraceptive, maternal, and newborn care for every woman who needs it for at least 5 years. We could fund a plan to end factory farming entirely by 2050. We could massively suppress or even eradicate the 20 neglected tropical diseases, which tend to affect the poorest billion in the world and tend to be incredibly cheap and easy to treat. And we could massively suppress or even eradicate malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV. Thank you. We're not doomed. We don't need to resign ourselves or our loved ones or our fellow humans or future generations to unnecessary and avoidable suffering, because we really can solve our biggest problems. And we don't need to throw away one of the most powerful tools we have to solve them, because philanthropy really can be transformative. And I think the thing to remember is that everything I've gone through today, it's not a complete list of the world's problems. It is one option for what we could do with 1 year's worth of funding from the 1% giving just 10%. Imagine what we could do in year 2. Thank you.
All right. There is so much to get excited about. So you did reference the, people earning 60K.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not as realistic to imagine committing 10%. But I love to turn a thought experiment or an idea into action. So how do we get even close to that 3.1 trillion number? What do you think we need to do?
Yeah, first of all, to reiterate that, it's not practical, and there shouldn't be an exercise in, making people feel guilty or that they should do things they can't afford. I think two things really help in terms of increasing donations. One is just information on global inequality. I think people think of the 1% in terms of rich countries, and just being aware that what's not extravagantly wealthy in rich countries is actually very wealthy in global terms. And I think the second thing is having options and having information. I think a lot of people, most people are incredibly generous and do want to improve the world, but it's not easy to navigate all the different options. And so one thing we try and do is just share this information as widely as we can.
Yeah. So talking about information, you mentioned Give Directly as a great organisation. They're an audacious grantee that we gave money to during the COVID pandemic and highly endorse sending your money that way. Are there any other ideas, organisations that you have researched that people can get access to?
Yes. Seconding Give Directly is amazing. I think for people giving, considering that as something of a benchmark can be really helpful. Another organisation I'd really recommend people check out is called GiveWell. So they're not a charity themselves. They evaluate all kinds of global health interventions to see which ones are kind of the best recipients, if you're interested in global health and development. Also, if you go to longview.org/pledge, you can see all of the research that we put together for this talk. And for each area, we break down where we've got the estimate from and where you can donate if you're interested.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.